Hello, I am Adam Kruger, and this is Lit Ideas, and today we are finishing our discussion of Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums, which is I have right here in the Road novels. This and several other stories within the greater Deloise legend, as he liked to refer to it as. But today we're talking about chapters 28 through 34, the end, and we're covering a little bit of some stuff that came right before the end because I was finishing up my last video. My 5-month-old puppy started barking endlessly. I thought about redoing the video, but I realized that she'd probably just bark again more, so what's the point? Anyways, as Kerouac ends Dharma Bums, which again, in my opinion, is his best book, even better than his far more famous On the Road, the last act of it, if you want to break it up in such a way, definitely is one of which falls into the tropes of some more of the regular Kerouac-isms that we've talked about in the past of travel and solitude and nature and parties and drugs and alcohol and nakedness, sex, all of that kind of fun stuff, as some of the more philosophical and thematic trappings of the book start to kind of fall apart on some level, but also fall into place in others as he begins to kind of gain a more full perspective of the role that Buddhism and being a Dharma Bum plays in his own individual life as a writer and as a beatnik and everything else. And what I mean by that is largely the last act or so falls into a lot of parties. There's a party that lasts for a couple days at the very end of the last section, into 25 to 26, 27, roughly around there, in which there's a lot of nudity. People are walking around naked, including Alva Goldbook, aka Allen Ginsberg, and his one of his lovers, I believe, and including Jaffe, and Jaffe's father is there. He's not naked himself, but he's very proud of his boy, and he accepts him for who he is, and everyone's having a grand time, and it's all rather beautiful. And as that goes on for a little while, Jaffe begins to plan his trip to Japan, in which he's going to further his studies in Buddhism, and leading up to a going away party, which shortly before that, Jack and Jaffe have a bit of an argument, as again I've mentioned. By the end of the novel, we see that Jaffe is far more human and far more flawed and less of a saint as before, which probably coincides with why Jack begins to take a slightly more pragmatic and practical approach to his ideals, as he begins to see that the people who he idealized so much aren't ideals at all. They're not Christ-like, they're not Buddha-like, they're all human. And as he begins to see some of the faults in some of the worldviews and, as I said, his own place in this. One of the ways in which he sees Jaffe as very imperfect, there's a really awkward scenario in which Jaffe's sister is introduced, and she's seen to be married, and Jaffe becomes very, very jealous of this, and Kerouac describes it all as very weird and surreal, and Jaffe makes some, at minimum, semi-incestuous remarks about if his sister can't find herself a real man, then he should be the one to be with his sister. And it's all very weird, and again we see the trappings of this saint kind of fall off into him as we see him for the flawed human being that he is. But still very much like Dean Mortuary, aka Neil Cassidy, On the Road, he's in many ways the thematic center of this novel in terms of what Jack is trying to deal with and what he's trying to reach and who he's trying to understand, empathize with, and convey to his audience and convey to himself even perhaps. But a lot of this ends up leading into a debate and a bit of a fight, and he says the last fight that he ever had with Jaffe, excuse me, but essentially it was over how they were living their lives, and as Jaffe was becoming wearisome of the party scene and drinking too much, and suggesting that Jack drinks too much, as he wanted Jack to go and read a poem at a place that he had scheduled for. He was going to read some of his poetry, I believe, from Mexican City Blues, which, by the way, helped inspire Allen Ginsberg to write Howl, so you might want to check that out because it's pretty awesome. But Jack decided that even though he agreed to do that earlier, that at this time he just wanted to drink and be merry and have fun and not worry about all these kind of responsibilities. And Jaffe has a more pragmatic sense of all of this, despite his idealism, and thinking that both Jack drinks too much and that he needs to focus on his art and his self and being active in the world, as we talked about earlier, which Kerouac clearly struggles with throughout this entire novel. And ultimately, Jack, at least temporarily, is able to convince him that there's wisdom in wine, as he says, and that he drinks for joy. And while this may be true in the moment, we clearly see throughout his later body of work what this happens to him as he devolves into somewhat of a pitiful, abysmal alcoholic and wino. But at the time, one of the ways he's able to kind of bridge this gap between Jaffe is him and Jaffe get drunk, and Jaffe writes a poem about their day and about being drunk. And Ray, Jack Kerouac's character, because remember they all have aliases here, essentially convinces him that he wouldn't have been able to write that poem had he been sober, kind of fitting in to the notions earlier dealing with Buddhism and consciousness, is that the world, is only, our perception of the world is only our consciousness, and that we have control over how we frame that and how we see that, and tying that into altered states of being in reality, drugs, alcohol, etc., in which Jack Kerouac clearly views as enlightening is a way, at least in an artistic way, in which he's able to help frame and shape his mind and the way he thinks and the way he writes. Whereas Jaffe comes along to a degree, but ultimately still thinks Jack is a bit too much of a drunk, because he is. But ultimately they're able to bridge that gap. They're able to go back to their parties with more nakedness, more music, more interesting discussions about Buddhism and the Dharma and philosophy and poetry and life. And again, as I said earlier, some of the philosophical and theological and thematic trappings of this begin to fall off as they just try to be one in the moment, as Jack Kerouac begins to realize more and more that heaven is real, at least in a metaphysical sense, that it's here and now if we're all able to love one another and accept everything and grow with all of it, which is one of the major philosophical underpinnings of many religions, Christianity included, and Buddhism to a degree, I believe, from a limited understanding of Buddhism. But you have to keep in mind too that Jack kind of combines these concepts, because even though it's somewhat unclear as to whether or not he completely believes in the literal Christ, he definitely is a big fan of what he represents, and of nothing else, that literary character of sorts, and his ideas and philosophies, which is a point of contention amongst him and Jaffe, as Jaffe is a more purist in his Buddhism of sorts, whereas Jack wants to find an amalgamation philosophically with whatever other religions and just modes of thought and ideologies that he can, in order to better understand the world and better cope with his own sufferings, as we've talked about in the past, because clearly that's one of his main interests in following a lot of these principles, is to gain happiness and peace of mind, essentially, because he clearly is a very troubled young artist, and as we see throughout his work, which becomes more evident the older he becomes in his latter novels and novellas and whatnot. And it ends with the parties kind of dying out. Jaffe goes off to Japan, and he ends up going and hitchhiking up north to Washington, where he's going to be a lookout at Desolation Peak, in which he writes Desolation Angels about later on. And it was Jaffe earlier in the novel who was able to set him up with that gig, because it's one that Jaffe had previously had in years prior. And by the time that he gets there, of course he goes through his usual Jack Kerouacisms of travel and hitchhiking and seeing the country and depicting the land, and it's all gorgeous and interesting. But essentially he ends up getting there, and at least initially he says that he's happier than he's ever been. And again, his anxiety fades away as he becomes one with nature, and he becomes to live a solitary life surrounded by nature, of which he sees at this point as heaven, going back to the idea that heaven is in the here and now, and that everything around him, particularly nature, is a manifestation of God. God in sorts. And it's here he says that he falls in love with God. And again, it's unclear as to whether this is just a metaphysical God or what, but I think that we're led to believe that's more along his lines of thought, is saying that God is in us and all around us and everything, versus the old man in the sky kind of archetype. So Kerouac clearly sees God, I think, in slightly more metaphysical terms. But there he's able to find happiness for at least a while. We do understand later that in the novel Desolation Angels, that it drives him half mad sometimes, the solitary confinement and all, and the isolation, despite the beauty. But that is another discussion in another book for perhaps another time, if we ever do get around to that one. But essentially it ends with, as I've said, him kind of finding his place, ideologically speaking, as a Dharma Bum, as a quasi-Buddhist of sorts, as a writer, is everything, and all of those identities beginning to intermingle, and for him to be able to have some peace of mind about everything. He's even able to have some visions about Rosie, the woman whose death really clearly haunted him. Rosie was the wife, or the fiance of Cody, aka Neil Cassidy, and it was her suicide that killed her, and it was that which drove him off into the wilderness earlier and has really haunted him. But he begins to see visions of her in a more Edenic and heaven-like and celestial body, and he begins to see how death is a part of everything, and he begins to accept this, and he begins to find joy in the life, and even to some degree the suffering, because to him he begins to understand that it's all beautiful. And it ends with all of these kind of ideas coming together on Desolation Peak, as well as a vision of sorts that he has of Jaffe, seeing him years later, and he sees him in a dream initially. But initially he looks like a Chinese man, like an older Chinese man initially. And I think this is depicting, of course, the fact that there's kind of a foreign element to Jaffe, because he's in love with Eastern philosophies, he's in love with Buddhism, he's in love with China, and he rejects so much of what he sees in the West and in America, and in our government and our way of life and our way of thinking. And of course, seeing him as of Asian heritage, because Jaffe's kind of is a white guy, of course, I'm sure it would be considered problematic in this day and age, but ultimately there's not a bone of hatred in Kerouac's body, I believe, and it's his just kind of strange, surreal, artistic representation. And again, it stemmed from a dream, so it's kind of hard to attack his subconscious too much. But of course, whatever. I'm sure there's some problematic elements in that, but he's able to see him as an older Chinese man, representative of these foreign intelligences and ideologies and theologies and sorts, and with the face of Dostoevsky, because obviously Kerouac is a big fan of the classics, and essentially what he's saying is there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in the face of Jaffe, as there is a tremendous amount of wisdom in representative of the body and the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who is clearly one of the greatest novelists of all time, and just an insane genius of sorts, even if you don't completely love every single thought that he ever had. I certainly don't, but the guy was good. And that's essentially how he ends this. He ends this with thoughts of Jaffe, and him returning to that idealized sort that he looked at him in the beginning as a kind of a saint and a perfect ideal of some fashion. So it ends on a very positive note, with the notion that despite all of our faults and despite all of our foibles and shortcomings, that we can still reach some state of happiness and peace, and in it find nirvana, heaven, whatever you want to say, and that's how he ends it. So that is the end of our analysis of Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time we're going to be talking about the Pulitzer Prize winning novel by Colson Whitehead, The Underground Railroad, which is about as different as you can get from this one. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for watching. And if you like this, subscribe to my channel, and you can follow me on Facebook, on my author page, Adam Kruger, author. See more content like this and information about my upcoming novel, as well as some short stories and blogs that I have on there. Thank you.